First of all, GMOs, genetically modified organisms, taking genes from one species and forcing it into the DNA of other species. Most people know about Roundup ready soybeans and corn, cotton, canola, and sugar beets and alfalfa. Those are crops engineered with genes from bacteria and some pieces of viral genes to allow those crops to be sprayed with Roundup. There's also corn and cotton plants that are engineered with bacterial genes that produce a toxic insecticide that pokes holes in the stomach of insects to kill them. Now, back in 1996, these were introduced into the food supply and into agriculture, and many of the independent scientists who were genetic engineers were very concerned. They knew intimately that the technology was not safe, was not predictable, and could lead to unpredicted side effects. I, in fact, learned about GMOs from one of these genetic engineers who was an award-winning genetic engineer and knew that we were about to expose the entire population to food that might have allergens or toxins or carcinogens, and there was no way to protect the people from these potential dangers, and that once these crops are released outdoors, the pollen can transfer, the seeds can move, and we've ended up contaminating the gene pool in a self-propagating way irreversibly. Now, the concern, however, was completely overridden by the politics and the economics. And this was most obvious at the FDA, where the scientists at the FDA repeatedly warned that GMOs were dangerous, that they could create these allergies, toxins, etc. But the person in charge of policy at the FDA was Monsanto's former attorney, Michael Taylor, later Monsanto's vice president and chief lobbyist, now back at the FDA as the U.S. food safety czar. And when he was in charge of policy for GMOs, the policy came out and falsely claimed that the agency wasn't aware of any information showing that GMOs were significantly different. This was actually the exact opposite of what was apparent to the scientists working at the agency. There, they knew the consensus was that GMOs were dangerous and needed to be tested. But based on this lie that there was no obvious difference, the FDA policy further went on to say no safety studies were needed, no labeling was needed. Years later, in 2009, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine looked at the animal feeding studies, saw gastrointestinal disorders, immune system problems, reproductive problems, organ damage, accelerated aging, problems with cholesterol and insulin regulation. They said these are not casual relationships, these are causal, and that all doctors should prescribe non-GMO diets to all patients. Now, thousands of doctors are doing just that, and we're hearing from the healthcare professionals and the people themselves that when they get rid of GMOs, they're getting better from these same categories of diseases and disorders: gastrointestinal, immune, reproductive, organ damage, even mood and behavior. Now, when individuals get rid of GMOs because they're not labeled, they have to create a strategy by switching to organic or reducing processed foods, and that means that they're changing their diet in a radical way, and that means that there may be many reasons for the improved health. But when livestock are taken off of GM soy or corn and switched to non-GM soy or corn, there are no such cofactors, and we're seeing the same improvements in the cattle and in the pigs that the people are reporting and are also afflicting the lab animals. We're also seeing the same problems in pets. I've interviewed many veterinarians and pet owners that say that their pets were suffering from intractable diarrhea, inflammatory bowel, itching, skin disorders, and low energy. When they put them on a non-GMO diet, all those things changed. If these things are causal, then we should see changes in the statistics in the United States that correlate with the introduction and expansion of GMOs, and that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing a very close slope between the increased use of GMOs and the increased incidence of autism, diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, all sorts of digestive disorders, all sorts of cancer, deaths from senile dementia, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. The list goes on. Now, if the list is so varied, how could GMOs themselves cause such problems? Well, there are two primary toxins found in GMOs. We've actually already mentioned them. The first is Roundup. Roundup is sprayed on most GM crops because most GM crops are Monsanto's Roundup Ready crops. The Roundup, 80% of it stays in the crop, and much of it gets deposited in the food that we eat. Now, I'll mention very briefly what Roundup can do to our system. In fact, it was said even better by two scientists who did a review paper last year, linking the properties of Roundup to heart disease, obesity, diabetes, cancer, birth defects and reproductive disorders, digestive problems, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, autism, anorexia nervosa, depression, and aggression. And a more recent paper by them linked it to gluten sensitivity, including celiac disease and kidney failure. Roundup kills beneficial gut bacteria, stops the gut bacteria from producing L-tryptophan, which is the precursor to serotonin, which is so necessary for mood and behavior and good feelings. And also it blocks the production of melatonin, which is part of our sleep cycle. It also blocks the ability of the body to detoxify other poisons. It also is an endocrine disruptor, promotes the growth of cancer cells, and damages the digestive enzymes and the digestive structures inside the intestines. It also may promote leaky gut, which is holes in the gut, and leaky gut is linked to cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, inflammation, autoimmune disease, etc. So just this one chemical can explain so many of the symptoms that are improving in humans, pets, and animals and are afflicting lab animals, said GMOs. Then we have the Bt toxin. Now, the Bt toxin is produced by corn and cotton plants, and it is designed to poke holes in the stomachs of insects to kill them. It's not supposed to have any impact on humans, but a 2012 study showed that it actually pokes holes in human cells. Now, if it pokes holes in our digestive tract, it might create leaky gut, which we say is related to autoimmune disease, inflammation, allergies, cancer, etc. Now, in a study in Canada in 2013, they found Bt toxin in the blood of 93% of the pregnant women tested and 80% of their unborn fetuses. What does it mean to have Bt toxin in the blood? Well, a study on mice showed that Bt toxin in the blood was cytotoxic, damaging the red blood cells. Now, it gets into the unborn fetus as well. The unborn fetus does not have a blood-brain barrier. So, if you have a hole-poking toxin circulating in the blood of the unborn fetus, it might end up in the brain where it can poke holes in brain cells. Now, Bt toxin in the blood should wash out quickly. So why does 93% of the pregnant women tested in Canada have Bt toxin in their blood? It's not Mexico where they eat Bt corn every day, corn tortillas. Most of the corn that's eaten in Canada is highly refined and has no Bt toxin left in it, like corn syrup or corn oil. The authors of the study speculated that the source of the Bt toxin was actually the milk and meat of animals that do eat Bt corn every day, and that it was stored in their system and then exposed to us when we eat the animals or drink the milk. A more provocative explanation goes back to a 2004 study where they found that part of the gene inserted into Roundup Ready soybeans actually transferred into the DNA of the bacteria living inside our intestines. And it may have continued to function. What this means is that even after we stop eating GMOs, part of that GMO may have transferred and taken up residence inside our gut and continued to produce genetically engineered proteins. Now, they never tested to see if the same transfer happens with corn chips. They only tested soybeans. But imagine eating a corn chip and the Bt toxin gene transfers to your DNA and your gut bacteria and starts to produce Bt toxin. In other words, converting your intestinal flora into living pesticide factories 24/7, around the clock, constantly. That might be a better explanation as to why 93% of the pregnant women tested in Canada had Bt toxin in their blood, because they're producing it inside their own guts. Now, these are very scary indeed theories, but if you look at the actual animal feeding studies, including one that was published yesterday republished by Dr. Seralini, he fed Roundup-ready corn to rats for 2 years, and the rats ended up dying much earlier, 2-3 times as much compared to controls. They had multiple massive tumors, huge tumors, and damage to their liver, kidneys, and pituitary. And they fed them Roundup-ready corn that had been sprayed with Roundup. They also fed a group of rats just the Roundup-ready corn that had not been sprayed with Roundup. Same problems. They fed another group of rats no Roundup-ready corn, just the Roundup, at levels that's considered safe in the human drinking supply, and the same problems came. We have incidences in Russia where more than half of the babies of mother rats fed genetically modified soy died within 3 weeks. We have hamsters by the third generation, most were sterile, some had hair growing in their mouths. They also had a 4 or 5 times rate of infant mortality. Now, my purpose of giving you all these things is to basically elevate the status of GMOs beyond just another problem. They may be responsible for the deaths or diseases of millions upon millions of people. Moreover, once they're released, we have no technology to fully clean up the gene pool. The indigenous corn varieties in Mexico have already been contaminated by genetically engineered corn from the United States. But already, many of you are thinking, what do I need to do to get rid of GMOs? Well, you can go to non-GMOshoppingguide.com or download the iPhone application Shop No GMO and learn how to avoid GMOs. But here's the good news. Unlike so many health and environmental problems, we can get rid of GMOs without having to change any laws. We talk about a tipping point, and this was exemplified in 1999 in Europe. A gag order was lifted on a scientist in February, which caused a firestorm of media. He had information about the health dangers of GMOs. Within 10 weeks, the tipping point in Europe was achieved, heralded by an announcement by Unilever that they were going to no longer use GM ingredients in Europe. The next day, Nestle said the same. The next week, virtually everyone else followed. The tipping point of consumer rejection has kept GMOs out of the direct ingredients in Europe, not any law in Europe. In 2005 or so, we saw a tipping point against bovine growth hormone kicked out of Walmart, Starbucks, Yoplait, Den, and most American dairies. Last year, in 2013, we saw a tipping point of consumer rejection against GMOs in the natural product sector in the United States. Whole Foods president said when a product becomes non-GMO project verified, it increased sales by 15 to 30%. Imagine running a product in the natural food space and hearing that if you're non-GMO project verified, you increase sales by 15 to 30%. Who in their mind would not become non-GMO in the health food industry and withstand that loss of market share? No one. Now, we have seen a rise in non-GMO eating. In 2007, 15% of Americans said they're already reducing or eliminating GMOs. In 2010, 25%. In 2013, 39%. In fact, in 2012, non-GMO labels expanded in sales faster than any other category of health or wellness claims, second fastest in 2013. This is a revolution. Now we have products like the original Grape Nuts, the original Cheerios, Smart Balance, Ben & Jerry's, the home brand of Target soon. These are non-GMO products in Walmart and Safeway and mainstream supermarkets. Now, it may seem bizarre, it may seem weird, it may seem odd, but in 100 years when they look back and say what it is that protected the genetic integrity of all living beings and all future generations, it might come down to sales of Grape Nuts at Walmart. Now, the reason I say that is this. Imagine that Grape Nuts increases sales. Grape Nuts has announced on the front of their package, non-GMO project verified. People walking down the aisles can see it. If they increase their market share as a result of that statement, everyone else in the food industry realizes it's not just a natural products trend. They must become non-GMO before their competitor. So we are now in the window, the greatest opportunity of advancement in the non-GMO cause in the history of the United States, maybe in the world. And it comes down to simply shifting behaviors. Now, we know exactly what to say and who to say it to shift behaviors. We know how to get people to avoid eating GMOs. We take that small 7-minute section that I told you about, expand it a little bit. You can watch it in Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives, at geneticroulettemovie.com. It's the most effective tool we have found at changing people's diet. So how do we get the Walmart shopper, the Safeway shopper, to avoid eating GMOs? We don't go to the just average Joe. We go to the moms to protect their children. We go to the pet owners to protect their pets. We go to the sick people who are already looking for ways to get better because they have serious illnesses that we think are related to GMOs. We go to healthcare professionals. We go to religious people who think GMO means God move over. At the Institute for Responsible Technology, where I'm the executive director, we have a master plan to kick GMOs out of the food supply within 3 years, within the feed supply within 5 years. And we're doing this through tipping point technology. In fact, we have played a critical role in creating the tipping points that have come recently. Now, the demand for non-GMO has sparked a demand for labeling. And so Vermont just passed a labeling bill that will go into effect in 2016 in July if the lawsuit against them doesn't thwart them and if the FDA doesn't come in and preempt it, saying states have no right to make that decision. So there are policies and laws that are going into place now in state levels that are also exemplifying the change in the thinking and the change in behavior. Now, if we get rid of GMOs in the United States, and in most countries, it's not all the countries that can be affected or protected by a tipping point phenomenon. There's one place in this country that would not necessarily be protected completely, even if GMOs are kicked out of the U.S. food supply, and that's Hawaii. Because Hawaii is ground zero for growing seeds that are sold around the world for the genetically engineered crops, and also for the experimental crops. So in other words, the new stuff that they're just now figuring out if it works or not. I was just in Hawaii last month for 2 weeks in Maui and Kauai, and I learned how the local population has been pummeled by the pesticides and herbicides that are sprayed on these seeds and experimental crops. And so for that particular region, a tipping point of consumer rejection, even taking it out of the food supply in the United States, may not fully protect that island and its environment, as they call the Aina, or its people. And so I have been so excited about the events happening in Hawaii, where people, as you'll hear tonight, have taken it upon themselves to create a citizens' initiative in both Kauai and Maui to turn things around, because the counties of those two, the county jurisdictions, are not stepping up. The state is not stepping up, and the country, the government, the federal government, is certainly not stepping up. And so there is an interesting dynamism here between market-based activism, where we can kick GMOs out of the food supply, and the need to create policy change. Now, the need to create policy change, I'm happy to say, to look around the world, there's some good policies that are happening. Starting in our own Oregon counties, Josephine and Jackson County, they kicked out the planting of GMOs in a citizens' vote this past May. In Italy and in France, courts upheld their bans of planting GMOs. Russia banned the imports of GMOs and the planting of GMOs. States in India have kicked out Monsanto. The army in China says they're no longer serving GMOs to the soldiers because it suspects that it will be causing certain health problems. Peru has a moratorium. Switzerland has a moratorium. So many jurisdictions are stepping up right now. So I have been on the trail on GMOs since 1996 for 18 years. And I can say that although this may be one of the most serious health and environmental problems that we face as a planet, I am more optimistic than ever. We are seeing the rise of consciousness, of awareness, of the evidence, and it is getting out. In spite of the disinformation campaigns by Monsanto and their colleagues, in spite of the pro-GM stance by the United States government, even the European Commission, and I am excited and proud to be on the call with the Hawaiian activists.